Good morning, everyone, again. Good to see you this morning. We're revisiting the second part of the woman of Shunem. We started last week looking in 2 Kings chapter 4, and I just want to pick out a few verses that Janet read to us this morning. Verse 18 of 2 Kings chapter 4 said, "The child grew, and one day he went out to his father who was with the reapers." Verse 20 says, "The boy was carried to his mother, who sat him on her lap until noon, and then he died." Verse 35, the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Verse 36, Elisha said, "Call the Shunammite," and when she came, he said, "Take your son." Verse 37, then she took her son and went out. I don't plan to preach to you today, but rather to tell you a story about that one woman's Bible experience as she endeavored to live a life of faith in God and faithfulness to God. Now, there are some people who are very knowledgeable of many of the Bible stories, and as preachers it's so easy for us to get drawn into the assumption that everybody will know the background of what we're talking about, so often that we can lose the focus of those who are listening. It seems to me that not many speakers are telling the story anymore. So how can the listeners get acquainted with what the background is? Even if some listeners are interested in reading the story for themselves, there can be a frustration in not being able to find out what part of the Bible it's in, and they leave it. But I believe that people's stories can be powerful in their own right, and from them we can be challenged, to be encouraged, we can be inspired, we can be strengthened just by other people's walk of faith. So I haven't got a number of points for you this morning. It's just a retelling of the story. Last week I spoke and began to tell the story of this unnamed lady from the Old Testament part of the Bible, and we called her the Shunammite woman because she lived in a place called Shunem. The Bible record of her life covers 3 distinct periods of time. The first part was covered last week, and as I spoke, I showed her to be a lady whose faith in God enabled her to swim against the many problem situations of the time and to keep faithful to God's principles through it all. She had the secret desire to have a son, but she knew it was impossible because her husband was too old. But God provided a miracle for her, and when we left her story at verse 17, she was holding that baby boy in her arms. She'd been faithful to God over many years without asking for any reward, but God had seen her deepest desire and graciously responded by giving her a child. What a lovely ending to a story. If it had been a fairy tale, we would have expected it to have carried on and said, "And everyone lived happily ever after." But this was not a fairy story. This was a real life situation. And it wasn't the end of the story for her either. We're only too aware that life is not wonderful all of the time. Even for people of faith and faithfulness, we can experience something of God's blessing in our lives, but it doesn't suddenly mean that we are immune to trouble and trauma and problems. Trouble, like sunshine and rain, comes to us all, whether we're good or bad, and often it comes unexpectedly. Things can be going smoothly one day, and the next day trouble strikes, and our lives can be thrown into turmoil. So we left this lady on a high note in verse 17 last week, but now we step into verse 18. We revisit her life once more, and it jumps from verse 17 to 18, and we can overlook the fact that life has now moved on for her several years. Nothing's told to us of those interim years, but I'm sure her life would have seen its fair shares of ups and downs and trials and difficulties and times of blessing and times of pain and times of joy. Whatever the woman had faced during that time, she'd kept faithful to God. She'd retained a deep sense of faith in God. And she'd also done a good job of motherhood, enabling this child to grow into a healthy, active young boy. Her experiences with God from the past had taught her to trust God in the problems of the present, and He would sustain her to face the problems of the future. So as we revisit this lady, she unknowingly is about to experience a great trauma in her life. The unthinkable was about to happen. Her son, the love of her life, the pride of her family, the wonderful God-given grace gift, was growing up. He was happy, he was healthy, he was lively, he was into everything that was around him. He wanted to be involved in everything that was happening. He was probably about 7 or 8 years old. And although she adored him, she would admit that he could at times be so annoying. His demands for attention when she was at her busiest were so irritating, but of course she wouldn't change it for the world. And because he'd been a miracle baby, she'd been a bit more overprotective of him. Her husband was of the opinion that she mothered him too much. But because of the culture and the circumstances of the time, boys were expected to grow up very quickly. The thinking of the day was that boys were not to be mollycoddled, if you understand that term, or perhaps you haven't heard it before, but mollycoddle means to mother them an awful lot. They had to be useful. They had to learn to be involved from a young age, and sometimes the expectation of them was far more than their age warranted. So how does this woman of faith react when the unthinkable happens? It was a day very much the same as most other days, but today she would have some peace to get on with things. She would be able to do her work in the home, and she'd get on with the business without the boy being under her feet. He'd gone out to the harvest field supposedly to help his father and the other workers that were gathering the crops. And I think she might have secretly had the thought, well, let his father have a taste of what it's like to have him around all the time. Let's see if he can get his work done when the kid is wanting all sorts of things. Let's see how he'll cope. But I can also imagine the father issuing instructions to the workers. Well, make sure you keep an eye on him. Don't let him go near the sharp instruments. Make sure he's out of the way when you're baling the sheaves, because we've got a deadline to meet. Keep him occupied in getting little bits and pieces that we leave behind. Have him to make small bundles of them to help the widows of the village when they come to pick up the things that we've left for them. For the boy, this was an exciting adventure. He was really getting into this grown-up work, but it wasn't easy. And although it was still early morning, the sun was so hot and there was no shelter, and I can imagine him taking off his outer tunic and then carrying on with the work. And then as the sweat began to come down his forehead, he would remove his head covering, and then he'd carry on with the work. And his father and the other workers were weather-hardened. They were so engrossed in what they had to do, they hadn't noticed the boy until suddenly they heard that distressing cry, with him holding his head in his hands and shouting, my head, it hurts." Sunstroke. The father, a typical man, says to one of the workers, "Take him home to his mother. She'll know what to do with him." So the worker carried him home. The mother immediately stops her chores. She cradled him in her arms. She sits him on her lap, trying to comfort him. But by the midday, the boy died. I can't even begin to imagine the trauma, the heartbreak, the shock that hit her in such a short period of time. Her hopes, her dreams were shattered. Her life seemed to be crushed. That miracle that God had provided now lay lifeless in her arms. What was she to do in such circumstances? There was, of course, the initial shock, the panic, the deep pain, the grief, even the bitter question, why God? Why is this happening? But then her deep faith kicked in. What a remarkable woman she was. She knew that of herself she didn't have the answer. She couldn't do anything to change the situation. Only her God could. And if God had miraculously provided her with this gift of a son, then only God could miraculously restore him to her. This was an issue that had to be dealt with between her and God alone before she confronted people. The prophet of God for the time was Elisha, the one that she had made a special room for him to stay in as he journeyed through her region. And since the time that she did that, her home and her business had known the blessing of God. And every time he stayed there, the presence of God was so real. Her access to God was through Elisha the prophet. So what better place to keep her son's body safe while she went to look for Elisha than in that special room that she'd prepared. And so she carried the boy up to his room and lay him on the prophet's bed and closed the door. She then went to the fields. She shouts to her husband, "Send me a servant and a donkey so that I can go to the man of God and return." The strange thing was the husband didn't inquire about the boy. He probably thought, well, she's sorted it. The sickness has passed. But he did ask why she wanted to go. It wasn't even a scheduled prayer time, or it wasn't a scheduled day of celebration. She avoided the direct answer. She said, "Don't worry about why I need to go. Everything will be all right. I'll be back soon." The actual Hebrew word that she used was shalom, which I always thought to be strange, because to me shalom meant peace, which it does. But I've since discovered that our word had a multifaceted meaning in Israel depending on the situation. It was used in a general conversation to greet people. Come in peace. Shalom. It was used to give good wishes to people, to live in peace. Shalom. It was said to say goodbye to people. Go in peace. Shalom. It was used as a general inquiry. Is everything okay with you? Shalom. It was used to give a response that all is well. Shalom. We do a similar thing in the valley life. We can pass someone in the street and there can be a polite acknowledgement with, "Are you okay?" "Okay, thanks." We can do that without breaking step. We don't even have to know the person that well to say it. It's a matter that it just flips off our tongue. We pass in people. "Are you okay?" "Yes, I'm okay." We could be going to the doctors to receive results from that test that we've had, and it's really worrying us, but the answer's still the same. "Okay, thanks." In a reply to her husband, this woman's shalom meant, "Don't worry, I've got it sorted." So he didn't debate anymore. He sent the servant and the donkey, and off she went. She didn't send the servant in a place she needed to seek God for herself. The woman's spiritual life had come from God. Her life up to that point had been blessed by God. He had sustained her through good times and bad times in the past. Where else could she find strength to carry on now in this emotional turmoil, in her bitter grief, in her disappointment? She didn't run away from God, she ran to him. Surely that's a lesson that we can take for ourselves. So often in problems we try and run away from God. Sometimes we blame God. Let's run to him. Elisha was at Carmel and he noticed a dust cloud on the distant road, and he kept on watching until he realized and recognized that this was the Shunammite woman. So he sent his servant Gehazi to meet them. He said, "Inquire whether it's her problem, her husband's problem, is it her son's problem?" And Gehazi starts out, and as he goes out to them, he shouts to them, "Shalom to you! Shalom with your husband! Shalom with your son!" In other words, he's asking, "Is everything okay?" She didn't even slow the pace, but as she passed him, she shouted, "Shalom" back. This wasn't time for small talk. This wasn't to talk about a problem with him. She needed to seek God directly first. When she came to where Elisha was standing, she flung herself off her donkey. She prostrated herself on the floor. She held him by the feet. And this action conveyed total surrender, total submission, a complete expression of faith. She was so overwhelmed and exhausted at this point, she couldn't even speak a word. But by that time, Gehazi had caught up with him, and seeing the woman's actions, he was angry. He was already feeling overlooked by the woman's refusal to confide in him. Now he saw what he thought was an irreverent act towards this man of God, and so he rushes forward to physically push her away. And I detect a tone of rebuke in Elisha's voice when he said, "Leave her alone. She's obviously in deep distress, and the Lord hasn't yet shown me what the problem is." See, Gehazi, the servant, had shown no sensitivity, no compassion, but Elisha had felt her pain. He'd empathized with her distress. Now, some people get the idea that the pastor or some respected preacher are somehow invincible, that they should have all the answers to life situations. But they don't have a textbook of solutions. They don't have something they can turn the page and say, let's see what the answer is for that. They don't know the whys, they don't know the hows, but God does. And until God speaks into specific situations, all the preacher has to offer is a sensitivity to the problem, is a compassionate heart, is a commitment to share in prayer. But eventually a frustration spilled out. It had been bottled up inside her all through this journey. She said to him, "I wasn't the one who asked for this child. Didn't I tell you not to raise my hopes?" So it became obvious to Elisha the problem was with the boy. Notice she hadn't admitted yet to anyone that he was dead. She was still holding on to her faith, which was, well, God gave him. God's going to have to restore him. Sometimes the respected man of God can get things wrong. Elisha's immediate response was to act on impulse, to act on his emotional level. He told Gehazi, "Prepare to run to the woman's house, take my staff with you, and when you get there, put my staff upon his head, and don't stop on your way, go straight there, and this is what you have to do. You have to lay it on and expect him to be restored." Can you imagine Gehazi's feeling at this important? It's sort of giving him a booster. What an honor. He was to be the substitute for God's presence. Can you imagine the kind of attitude as he ran? That woman ignored me. She failed to respond to my status. She underestimated my authority. Now she'll see that when I get there, I'm the man for the job. Well, after Gehazi left, the woman very bravely challenged Elisha. She said to him, "I'm not happy with your decision. It's not going to work. As surely as the Lord lives and you live, I will not leave you. If you're not coming with me, then I'm not going home." How audacious that statement was. She actually saying to him, what you've done is your idea, but it's not God's idea. So it's not going to work. What this situation needs is a direct contact with the presence and power of the Almighty. And you are that contact. I think that's a pretty brave challenge for her to make to that man of God. But to Elisha, it wasn't offensive. It brought back to his mind the reminder of his own determination to receive something more from God. Hadn't he used exactly the same words when his predecessor Elijah was about to depart this life? He had said to him, "I'm not going to leave you until you bless me. I'm going to keep going with you until you depart. You've got to give me a double portion of the Spirit of God that you have." And he received it. So now he humbly bows to her request and he goes with her. On their way, they meet Gehazi on his way back. And he said, I did exactly what you told me. I went through the procedures. I laid your staff on his head, but the boy didn't revive. You see, if anything was to be done, it would not be found in man's methods. And that woman knew it. Sometimes we can get taken up with our religious traditions, with our certain procedures. We can even try and copy what works for others. But if it's not directed by God, it will surely fail. Even Elisha, the man of God, had got it wrong this time. He'd implied to Gehazi to follow this pattern, go through this procedure, follow this religious ritual. It hadn't worked. The Shunammite woman's faith was not daunted by the news, because it's what she had expected. And so she kept prompting Elisha to continue the journey. And when he arrived, Elisha entered his room. He went in alone and he shut the door behind him, because this situation required privacy and intimacy with God. And you know, for us as a church, there's great value in public, open, and audible prayers. It encourages us, strengthens us as a family. It stimulates other believers to add their confirmation to the prayers that are being made. But there are those times when only private, intimate prayer will do. When it's just you and God, and whilst you pour out your heart to Him one-to-one. I thought of one of the insider tips that Jesus gave His disciples in Matthew chapter 6. He said to them, He said, when there's difficult situations, He said, when there's prayer, when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your heavenly Father who's unseen. And then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. For Elisha, this was one of those times of personal intercession between him and the Almighty. And we're not told what his prayer was, but if you'd allow me this morning to suggest to you perhaps the type of prayer that he might have made, it would be something like, Lord, I've tried to do things my way, and it has failed miserably. Please forgive my human effort and my sense of self-sufficiency. For only you are God, and I am surrendering to your way. I give you this child. You gave this child as a grace gift to this family. It was a miracle. You gave your word to this woman who received it in faith, and it came to pass. I now urgently ask you again to do the seeming impossible and restore life back to this child and show yourself to be the Almighty One. There's no record, of course, of what that prayer was. Just my sort of thinking, how I imagine it might have been. But then Elisha identified himself fully with the need. He lay on top of the boy's body. He was mouth to mouth, hands to hands. And after a while, the boy's body began to get warm. And then Elisha got up and he prayed again. And then he did the same thing. And something began to happen. There was a sudden violent movement, and the boy sneezed. And he sneezed. And he sneezed again. 7 times in all. Now, I haven't any scientific or medical suggestion as to the sneezing process or why it happened that way, but I do know that in the Bible there is a significance in numbers, and that number 7 in Scripture is quite significant. We haven't got the time to follow that thought through this morning, but number 7 always represents completion, totality, perfection. And so for me, these sneezes represent a total, complete, perfect restoring of life miraculously by God. Now, in our current day understanding of medical science, when the blood supply has been cut off from the brain for up to 4 minutes, and then a recovery occurs, there is for high expectation that brain damage would occur. But for this boy, his recovery was total. No disability, no loss of brain function. He was restored to an energetic, healthy life with no adverse effects. A complete perfection and an unquestionable miracle. Because if you give some thought to the time scale involved, since the boy died at noon, and then giving the woman servant the benefit of being extremely fit, even fitter than dust, running alongside that donkey for that long distance, and then meeting with Elisha, and then the journey back, it would have been something like about 10 p.m. in the evening at the earliest that they would have returned. And so to the natural mind, the boy had no chance of recovery, let alone survival afterwards, and yet God revived him, God restored him, made him into a perfect state of health. What a miracle! What a great thing for this unnamed woman of faith and faithfulness. Man-made processes and procedures couldn't provide the miracle, but the presence and the power of God working in response to faith did. Within our Christian church life, we can design great programs, we can preach great sermons, we can attract great people, we can do good church together, but without that powerful presence of the Lord, it all becomes just a religious activity. Where the presence of the Lord is, there is in that place the potential for anything to happen. That's something we tend to overlook sometimes. We can so easily respond to the Lord's words where he said, where 2 or 3 of you have gathered together in my name, I am there. But no, if we really believe that, what should be our expectation when we come together, when we meet together, when we're in unity of purpose? The Lord there, his presence there. We can expect great things. I think we need in these days the presence and power of God amongst us to turn our dead religiosity into a living faith dynamic. The Shunammite woman received a triumphant fulfillment of her faith. Elisha said, take your son. He lives. Today, may we embrace that fact that in whatever trouble life brings our way, we always have someone we can turn to. We always have someone who responds to faith. And we're encouraged this morning not to be overwhelmed by circumstance, but to overcome by faith and by God's word. For us, the story ends there, a high note. But this story doesn't end there for this remarkable unnamed woman. All that she received was by the grace of God. And God was to be so gracious to her later on in her life. We can't look at it today, but perhaps another time we'll revisit her story to get the last part. But for today, I trust that her story will encourage us to serve God faithfully, to trust him wholeheartedly, to be strengthened in knowing that our great God can solve any problem, and expect him to do more than we can ask or even think. For our God is a great God, and he holds us in his hand. God bless you.